podcast listeners. I am your host, Megan Grace, and this is another episode of Change the Channel podcast. Welcome back to Change the Channel. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you are having an amazing day. So in this episode, I'm going to bring you back to another one of my favorite places, the airport. No one is surprised. The airport, my podcast may as well be sponsored by the Portland airport at this point because there's so many amazing experiences that I have when I'm traveling. On this episode, I met another individual in the TSA pre-check line. We both had, again, underestimated the amount of time that it would take to move through the airport. And so we were bonding over the fact that there were new machines and the process was going a little bit slower. And it was kind of nice to just have someone to talk to. And then we looked up and I asked, where are you going? And he said, Austin. And I said, oh my gosh, me too. And so we figured out that we'd be able to walk to the gate together. And as we were walking, we're kind of talking back and forth in little bits. And I started asking him random questions. This is another thing I love to do. I am a just insanely curious person, and most of my questions feel like they come out of midair, but it's really just because I want to know more about the person than maybe where they work or, what their favorite color is. I'm interested in knowing just how people function, like how they tick, what's going on in their minds. And so we got to the, we were waiting to board the plane and we were in line and I started talking about his vision for the world. And I asked him, if you could change anything that's or bring something to be, or, just make an impact, you could snap your fingers and it would just be. No questions asked, no work at all. What would you bring forward? And he said, I would want humans to be able to fly, which is kind of funny because we're about to get on an airplane. But he clarified. He said, I would want humans to be able to fly by themselves. I said, oh, interesting. Well, tell me more about that. And he said, well, it'd be interesting for it to be in a magnetic field or, so something kind of effortless. And I was really lost in his story. I was wanting to know more about what this would be like, what it would change, how it would enhance being a human being. And so when he turned the question back and said, well, what about you? My mind went blank. I wasn't thinking about anything. I was in his story. I was listening. I was deeply, actively listening. And he goes, well, what about you? And I go, oh, wait, I'm actually not sure. And he goes, come on. Whenever people ask questions like that, they've got a great answer, just teed up, ready to share. Like, come on, what is it? And I looked at him and I said, I get that. I do feel like that's a lot of the ways that people listen. But in this moment, I actually was just really enthralled in what you were sharing. And so much so that I kind of feel like I was just in your world. And he looked at me and goes, interesting. And I said, I'm just becoming very aware of how often if I have an idea of what I'm going to say next, I completely miss out on what the person right in front of me is saying. And so in this moment, I wanted to practice just listening to what you're saying. And he looked at me and he goes, you're right. We are constantly trying to come up with the next thing to say. You miss out on the story that's right there. And then he looked at me and kind of like, okay. He goes, so are you really not going to answer the question? And I laughed and, I answered the question. Of course, the thing that I would want the world to have is people to be deeply, energetically, and intellectually connected to their bodies and emotionally connected to those around them. I just told him how I kind of feel like a lot of times we're walking around in bodies that we are disconnected from. And in my mind, I feel like a lot of things could potentially shift and change in this world if we were aware of the bodies that we have and the impact that they make. He goes, oh, okay, great. It's like, you want to go over here and like solve world peace, and I just want people to fly. I said, but I don't think that it's what you want to change. I think it's just even the exercise of imagining that life could be different than it is now, I feel like is important. He goes, yeah, you're right. You are right about that. And we went our separate ways. We sat in our separate seats, and it just got me thinking, how many times during the day am I listening to someone to find an in to be able to speak instead of actually being with them? And what does it cost me to simply be in the other person's story with them? It doesn't cost me anything. In fact, it can actually enhance my life by learning about something from a different perspective than I ever would have had in the past. The look on his face, the surprise and shock when I didn't just have an answer right away, I felt like that was so important. And the fact that that is our daily operating. People are used to being talked over. People are used to not being listened to. People are used to their ideas being just one swipe away from yesterday's news. What would it change if, when we ask a question, we looked at the person and just got lost in their world, asked a few more questions, allowed the person to be seen just a little bit more deeply? Who knows? You might end up with a conversation that went from, man, the TSA pre-check line is going slow today, to these are our visions for the world. These are the things that I'm interested in changing or being a part of enhancing, or what would it be like for human beings to be able to fly in something other than airplanes? Because as he pointed out, if we could all just fly to and from places, he said, well, maybe there'd be more connection. Maybe people would be able to go and visit friends of theirs that lived wherever, and maybe people would feel more connected. And I was thinking, that's amazing. And if I would have just, waited for my next turn to talk, he would have said people were fly, and I would say my thing. Would we have really connected, or would we have just both said our things, essentially laid them out on the table, the other person looked at it, we picked them back up from the table and went our separate directions? So for today, I'm planning to move through the world with a little more curiosity, asking a few more questions, sitting a little bit longer in someone else's vision, and see what magic unfolds. I invite you to do the same. Thanks so much for tuning in to Change the Channel podcast. Have a wonderful day.